Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel YNR Daily Spoiler. Phyllis overhears Kane and Victor's secret plot.
She had heard too much. Phyllis overhears Kane and Victor's plan, and then she is eliminated. Phyllis didn't mean to eavesdrop. She was hunting for her buddy Jade, who had snuck into the powder room. With a glass of wine in hand, she strolled around the room until she arrived at the entrance to Victor's private study, where he had been conducting smaller meetings. She froze as she heard voices, low anxious tones that people employ when they believe walls are thick. "We can make it look like a compliance issue," Victor stated. His voice was the same cold, mechanical Phyllis had seen on dozens of tapes and heard in boardrooms all throughout the city. "There will be a memo, a review. We'll reveal the figures to the press. Kane, offer it as stewardship." Kane's voice sounded older and more temperate. "Victor, we need to be cautious. If something appears to be excessively staged, we will lose moral authority. People sympathize with the underdog. If we are perceived as predatory, it backfires on us." "Then let it be messy," Victor said. "The mess is manageable." "No, the truth is not. Truth requires you to choose between family and legacy. We are the legacy." Phyllis put her back against the antechamber's wall, her heart beating like a staccato drum. Their strategy was more than just legal maneuvering. The tone in Victor's speech hinted at something else, a solution to remove impediments, and a pledge to neutralize a witness who would reveal the scheme's soft underbelly. Remove and problem hung like an omen. "What if she went public?" Kane inquired. "Phyllis shared the lab story with us years ago. She's a loose wire who wields media like a weapon. Do you want to silence her? A quiet that could drown out the entire room." Phyllis's name felt like a hot coal in her hand. She had endured so many humiliations that she had not expected an orchestration with her as a target variable. Perhaps Victor and Kane only intended to degrade her, financially wreck her, isolate her. But the intensity in Victor's words implied a strategy to eliminate rather than simply ruin. Phyllis recalled all the times she had been crushed and still managed to get back up. She didn't want to be chewed up this time. She took out her phone. She was able to record. She could contact a person she trusted. She pressed the tiny red button with trembling hands and felt the small wired click like a blessing. If she could get proof of what they were planned, she could use it to stage a dramatic return that would make people forget her previous mistakes and remember her as the lady who brought down a game. She imagined headlines and the delicious circle of retaliation. She continued to listen. "Victor, we'll have a network," Kane announced. "We'll give the auditors the correct numbers, and they'll begin a review. We pull the financial strings. In a few days, they'll be desperate. The donor panic motivates people to act, and that is how we obtain their shares." "And about Phyllis?" "Handled," Victor said. "We openly denigrate her, linking her to the losses. Make her appear irresponsible. If she resists, we'll escalate." Phyllis felt the blood draining from her face. The plan was simple and straightforward. It was also illegal on several levels, including fraud, interference, and possible obstruction. She lifted a corner of the door and crept back into the room, like a thief who had discovered a safe. Her phone was still recording, and the red light twinkled like the eye of a small, grim god. Her first thought was survival. Send the recording to someone who could use it. The second was greed's twin, the desire to use it for herself. She was capable of blackmail. She had leverage. She could become wealthy enough in a weekend to put an end to the humiliation that had dogged her career. Her ambition was planted in the soil of her past experiences. She already had a plan in the works. Phyllis didn't know how long she had. She was unprepared for the ensuing shadow scramble. As she turned to leave, a soft, deliberate footstep could be heard behind her. She whirled, holding the phone to her chest. "It's late," a voice stated. "You shouldn't be here." The light shone on a familiar face, Kane. Most people were misled by his carefully civilized demeanor. Phyllis had always distrusted him in the same way a wary animal does a predator who smiles too much. Tonight, the smile vanished. "I was looking for Jade," Phyllis said in a false bright. She tried to put the phone away. Kane moved like a man who enjoyed closing doors with purpose. He moved forward and blocked her path. Victor had taught the world a simple, effective strategy. Remove the loose wire first. You shouldn't have heard that, he said quietly. You're dangerous, Phyllis. Dangerous. She blinked, attempting to work the angle. I'm a gossip writer with a column. You're creating empires. He drew closer, his face displaying the discipline of gentlemen who learned to wield comfort as a weapon. I don't want you getting involved, Kane stated. You'll ruin it for everyone. Phyllis felt like a villain smiling. You underestimate me, she remarked. You always have. But I'm not in the mood to be delicate. She reached for her phone. Kane reacted faster than she anticipated, and the device tumbled out of her grasp and into the space beneath the table. It pinged once while recording. Phyllis let out a short, brittle laugh and moved to retrieve it, but Kane's hand closed around her wrist with an iron that made the bones sing. You're making a mistake, he stated. I made bigger mistakes, she responded. Do you think you scare me? He let her go like a man who had calculated risk and chose to escalate. Please go home, Phyllis. You don't get to make demands of me, she snapped. Not after what you and Victor plan. You can't just walk into a room and decide who will be erased. Kane tightened his jaw. You don't know what you're talking about. She did understand. The phone was recording. The USB she might have used was gone. The words were in the cloud of her device's memories. She made one more move, not to take anything, but to rattle it. She leaned in and whispered, You two will be sorry. I'm aware of everything. Kane was not only trying to keep his cool before speaking. He was also a man who had just been told that someone was going to topple a house of cards he'd built with Victor. He lunged forward, not with purpose, but with the panic of someone losing control. Phyllis lost her footing. Her head struck the corner of a sturdy teak desk. For a split second, the world tunneled into an abstract of light and sound. The recording continued. As a witness to the event, Kane stumbled back in surprise. He did not intend for her to fall, but rather to frighten. Phyllis slumped. The wine glass shattered at her elbow. The sound prompted people to rush in. Jade, who had returned with 2 friends, and others discovered Phyllis lying on the floor, limp. The room filled with voices, and the chaos of the night turned into disaster. Someone called an ambulance, while another called the police. The crowd gathered around Victor and Kane, the 2 men who had been in the study moments before, their faces masked with concern and grief. At the hospital, the story shifted like a breeze. Phyllis had received a head injury. The doctors talked in clinical tones about concussions, swelling, and the fragility of the human brain. For hours, she lay under lights as people walked the plank of possibility. A brain bleed surgery, the kind of critical narrative that forces family members to ask impossible questions about fate and accountability. Kane stood at the foot of her bed, as if he were learning guilt. He told the nurses the version he had rehearsed in his head. He had argued with Phyllis, but it was only a push and an accident. It was the type of explanation that lawyers can twist into a story that absolves. He kept his hands folded and his voice gentle. Victor sat in an armchair across from the bed, hands clasped, eyes rimmed with fatigue that could easily be misread as genuine concern. Helicopters from the news service circled. The headlines read, Phyllis falling. Gala turns tragic. Speculators wrote. The angle appealed to the reporters. A fallen queen of tabloid drama was injured in an altercation with a man associated with the Newman Empire. The first sections assumed an accident. Kane's people spread a story about an unfortunate slip, possibly due to too much champagne. It was a neat explanation, which the front pages preferred because neat explanations sell. However, someone inside knew better. Phyllis's phone had been recording for long enough for the cloud to pick up a small fragment and begin uploading. The exchange in the study, the discussion about a plan, and then the sound of her fall. Whether the entire file was released was dependent on technology and fate, as well as a variety of minor factors that determined the course of a scandal. Across town, Nikki Newman's assistant received an anonymous file drop. The message's headline read, Listen. She made a click. The file was corrupted at the end, but what played was enough to startle me. Victor's voice, Kane's voice, then Phyllis's, followed by a sickening thud and the sound of someone laughing, which could have been embarrassment or fear. When the portion was forwarded to Victoria, Panic spread throughout Victor's inner circle. When Victoria looked at the audio clip on her phone, she felt the floor give in. The worst occurred at the hospital, where tests revealed swelling and hemorrhage. Phyllis's condition deteriorated faster than anyone had predicted. A neurosurgeon put it bluntly, brain injury can sometimes be irreversible. The whole city was riveted. Friends and enemies flocked to the waiting room to pay their respects, as a life was divided into before and after. Then, without a dramatic recovery, Phyllis passed out and did not wake up. The doctors called it a catastrophic brain injury. No one used the word murder. Yet, the coroner needed to determine the cause of death, which required evidence. However, the conversation in the study, the partially uploaded recording, and witness testimony were already creating a dangerous fabric. Grief gathered in the city studio like an oil slick. People who both loved and despised Phyllis were taken aback by how raw her absence felt. Sharon, who had been at odds with Phyllis for years, sat stunned. Nick's rage was a dry one. He wanted arrests, answers, and justice. Victor, of course, expressed his grief publicly, but his private world closed like a fist. Within hours, he had hired the best crisis lawyers money could buy, and his men quietly whispered to the appropriate reporters about an unfortunate accident, a tragic incident. But in the legal realm, 1,000 little things began to gnaw at the neat story. Phyllis's phone, which had captured the study conversation, now displayed recent uploads and automatic cloud sync activity that could be subpoenaed. The fragment that had emerged was not the entire file. Devon called in experts to investigate the upload and determine whether the device had been remotely accessed. He suspected that the audio clip that reached the Newman circle was not an accident, but rather a deliberate breadcrumb. Detective Rivera, composed and unflappable, took the lead. The first facts were stark. Phyllis had died from a head injury. The Newman study's security footage captured some of the argument. Kane's story was inconsistent. He claimed a brief scuffle, an accidental push, but the footage, grainy but revealing, showed a hand on her arm, a phone dropping, and then Phyllis slipping in a wordless cascade. Victor claimed he was in the room, but had not touched her. Witnesses at the gala gave varying accounts, and the timeline provided opportunities for narrative. The city howled for an answer. Would Victor and Kane be implicated? For the general public, the notion that the town's most powerful men might have ordered or enabled the removal of a loose wire like Phyllis was both appealing and repulsive. For those who adored Phyllis, it was deeply personal. When Kane was arrested for questioning, he was a picture of brutal calm. He insisted it was an accident. Victor, who was represented by solicitors and boards, was summoned to testify about the study meeting and the questionable financial transactions. The term elimination had not been claimed by any official. It existed only on the lips of gossipers and in the wilder corners of social media. The critical twist came days later, when Devon extracted more information from the cloud. Phyllis had attempted to send the entire file in the final moments before blacking out. She had hit send before she could be completely silenced. It was addressed to multiple people, not just one, as a precautionary measure. One of the recipients was not a friend, but rather someone she had feared, a reporter who owed her a favor. He had gone to print with a question mark and a promise of more to come, rather than the entire story. The piece landed in the morning paper and went off. When investigators subpoenaed corporate emails, they discovered a second, more damning layer. Vince, a shell contact, had been used to seed a fraudulent audit months before. Victor's inked fingerprints on the plan were faint, but present. Kane's ledger entries revealed that he had approved motions that indirectly supported the plan's financial mechanics. Motive did exist. There was an opportunity. The means were murky, but there were many hands capable of turning violence into misfortune. Genoa City was divided into camps. Some demanded immediate indictments, while others warned of the dangers of rushing to judgment. In the midst of it all, Phyllis's funeral was a private, roaring event. A queue of people paying their respects, sobs disguised as coughs, pressed faces that had once smiled at galas. Sharon read a eulogy with a trembling but steady voice. Phyllis was mean, messy, and human. She did her best with the resources she had. As a legal net tightened, A new revelation emerged like a long-buried secret pushed by construction equipment. A second recording from Phyllis's phone surfaced, not about the study, but about a late-night call she'd received from Victor's panicked aide, who had begged her not to reveal a specific donation trail. The aide's faint voice in the clip implied that Victor's men were doing dirty work. The clip was merely circumstantial, but it made the case much messier. Strategies were executed in courtrooms and boardrooms. Victor's legal team argued influence, misinterpretation, and coincidence. Kane's lawyer pleaded accident, claiming that he was trying to keep her out of trouble, not causing her death. Devon and the prosecutors argued intent in several layers, including premeditated pattern, motive, obstructed recordings, and inconsistent statements. The city treated every hearing as if it were a long-running drama. Secrets were revealed on the stand, including back-channel emails, notarist payments, and the kind of human pettiness that corrodes power structures. On television, names were cleared and accused again. However, trials take time, which headlines do not respect. If the net of justice was to remain intact, patience was required. Meanwhile, the quietest subplot of the entire horrific event began to emerge. Phyllis's last bravado, attempting to upload her file, was the act of a woman who refused to be erased. She was aware of the risks associated with speaking. She knew that powers move like tides, but she risked everything to find out the truth. That act, more than anything else, altered the course of the investigation. It transformed elimination from a tidy joke to a possible crime with a proven motive in court. Weeks later, when the coroner revealed that the cause of death was blunt force trauma, which was inconsistent with an accident, the prosecutors changed their strategy. The subsequent indictment accused Kane of involuntary manslaughter and Victor of conspiracy to obstruct justice and tamper with evidence. It was not the tidy ending that everyone had hoped for. It was the beginning of a long legal battle. Nick, who had a complicated and combustible relationship with Phyllis, spoke from a place of grief that the cameras couldn't capture. "We will get answers," he stated plainly. Phyllis deserved better. Victor, on the other hand, divided his time between legal defense and media statements intended to protect the empire. He denied wrongdoing, invoked public service, and defended his right to due process. Kane, who had been arrested and was awaiting trial, sat with a look of contrition and defiance. Phyllis's death did not raise her to the level of an angel. She'd been fierce and sometimes merciless. But the city had a way of turning a complicated life into a moral lesson. Speak, and you may be silenced, but sometimes speaking causes others to put down their instruments. The story didn't end with the indictment. Trials uncovered more dirty laundry, hidden transfer routes, and a slew of complicit officials who lined pockets and knitted alibis. Some people fell. Some made agreements. The public never quite stopped debating whether Phyllis's death was a tragic accident or a deliberate removal. But when the final gavel fell months later, after appeals and reruns, justice in Genoa City felt fragile and on a ledge. For Sharon and the few who had loved Phyllis in a messy, human way, the verdict could never make up for all the nights of public humiliation, nor could it restore a life stolen. However, the fact that a court had reviewed the evidence and reached a decision was significant. Following a verdict that divided the city, those who remained at Phyllis's small graveside said the things people say to make themselves whole: apologies, confessions, and promises to do better. Victor remained an unmistakable presence in that fractured world of power, despite having lost political ground, public favor, and the image of invulnerability. Kane's career was on the verge of collapse. The moment his hand had caused another woman to fall would forever mark his legacy. In the end, the USB that recorded the plan, the shattered phone, and the rushed hospital calls served as instruments for a harsh public lesson. Phyllis had heard too much, and because she had dared to record what she had heard, the city couldn't simply ignore the story. She had been eliminated. However, her final act lit a torch that demanded accountability. The opera of Genoa City continued. Men and women returned to boardrooms and beaches. Marriages faltered and welded in novel ways, and scandals were catalogued in the town's infinite ledger. But beneath the glitz was a small, quiet truth that refused to be completely erased. In a town that values power above all else, those who speak out against the machine risk everything, and sometimes give everything, so that others can live with the hope of justice.